Hi, in this video we're going to be going over lesson 8.3, rewriting decimals as fractions and mixed numbers. In the first example, we have a visual model that represents a decimal that goes to the tenths place because we have 10 equal parts in our model. Now in the model, 3 out of the 10 parts are shaded, which means that we could write that as 3/10. Now we're also going to write that as an equivalent decimal. Because 10 is our denominator, that tells us that we're going to write our decimal to the tenths place. So as a decimal, it would be represented as 3/10. So when 10 is the denominator, that tells us that we're going to put the numerator in the tenths place. For our second example, we have a mixed number represented in our model. We have one whole shaded, and then we have 6 parts shaded of our second whole, which means that we have 1 6/10 shaded. Now we can also simplify 1 6/10 because we can simplify 6/10 by dividing both the numerator and the denominator by 2. When we divide 6 by 2, we get 3, and when we divide 10 by 2, we get 5, and then we have our whole left over. So 1 6/10 would simplify to 1 3/5. Now if we were to take 1 6/10 and figure out what the equivalent decimal is equal to, our 1 tells us that we have 1 in the ones place, and then we have a 6 in the tenths place. So remember again, whenever 10 is the denominator, you put the number that is the numerator in the tenths place. Our next examples show that there are 100 parts in a whole. So in our first example, there are 8 squares shaded of the 100 squares in the model, which means that we have 8/100ths shaded, which we would represent as 8 out of 100, or 8/100ths. And then because 100 is our denominator, that tells us that we're going to be writing our decimal to the hundredths place, which is the second digit to the right of the decimal place. So we would write it as 0.08 because we have 1, 2. 2 places to the right of the decimals place is our hundredths place. Now we go back to our fraction 8/100ths. We can simplify that further by dividing both our numerator and our denominator by 4. When we divide both our numerator and our denominator by 4, we get a simplified fraction of 2/25. So 2/25 would be equivalent to 8/100ths. Next, we have a decimal that is greater than 1. We have 2 holes that are shaded in, and then we have 27 squares shaded in out of the 100 squares in one hole. So to write that as a mixed number, we have 2 holes and we have 27/100ths. 2 27/100ths would be in simplest form. The final step would be figuring out what the equivalent decimal would be. Because 2 is our whole number, we would put a 2 in the ones place, then our decimal point, and then our decimal would go to the hundredths place because 100 is our denominator. So we would write it as 2 27/100ths. Next, we're going to extend writing our fractions and decimals to the thousandths place. So now we're going to be using cubes. If we were to count up the number of cubes that are shaded in the first example on the left, there would be 45 cubes shaded that we would count. And there are 1,000 cubes in the big cube, so we would write that fraction as 45 over 1,000, or 45 thousandths. If we were to then change that into a decimal, because 1,000 is the denominator, our decimal is going to go to the thousandths place, which remember is the third digit to the right of the decimal point. So it would look like 0.045 because we want to go to the third place to the right of the decimal point. If we were to take a look at 45 thousandths and simplify that further, we could divide both 45 and 1,000 by 5. When we divide 45 by 5, we get 9, and when we divide 1,000 by 5, we get 200. So it would simplify to 9/200ths. If we take a look at the example on the right, we have one full big cube shaded, which tells us that we have a whole. And then if we were to count up the number of cubes that are shaded in the second cube, there would be 128 of the 1,000 cubes shaded. So to write that as a mixed number, we have one whole and we have 128 thousandths. When we go and translate that to a decimal, we put a 1 in the ones place, and then because 1,000 is our denominator, we're going to write our decimal to the thousandths place, which is the third place to the right of the decimal point. And so we write 128 to the right of the decimal point. If we were to simplify 128 thousandths, we could divide both 128 and 1,000 by 8. When we divide 128 by 8, we get 16, and when we divide 1,000 by 8, we get 125, and then we don't want to forget our whole number 1. So 1 and 128 1,000th would simplify to 1 and 16 125ths. For our last two examples, we're going to write each decimal as a fraction or a mixed number in simplest form without using a visual model to help us. If we look at 6.7, we would read that as 6 and 7/10. So remember, whenever there's a decimal point, you plug in the word and. So it's 6 and 7/10. So if we would want to write that as a mixed number because it's greater than 1. So we have 6 wholes, and then we have 7/10. So we would write it as 6 and 7/10. Now remember, that works because the 7 is in the tens place, which means that our denominator would become 10. If we take a look at the second example, we have 0.075. If we look at our place values, we have our tens place, our hundredths place, and our thousandths place. So because our decimal goes all the way to the thousandths place, when we write that as a fraction, 1,000 is going to be our denominator. And then if we look at how we would read what we have in our decimal, we have 75. So that means that we have 75 thousandths, which we can simplify by dividing both 75 and 1,000 by 25. When we divide 75 by 25, we get 3, and when we divide 1,000 by 25, we get 40. So 3/40ths would be the simplified fraction of 75 1/1000ths.